Welcome to the Doctors Making a Difference podcast. Doctors change lives every day, but what happens when life changes yours? A single injury, a sudden illness, your career, your income, your future can shift in an instant. The best physicians don't just plan for success, they protect it. At Set for Life Insurance, they believe financial security isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. True own occupation disability insurance ensures that no matter what happens, your future stays in your hands. Because protecting your income means protecting everything you've built. Visit drpodcastnetwork.co/set for life today. Secure your future before life makes the choice for you. We have Mr. Ron Richards on the podcast today. Some of our podcasts are, well, most of them are physicians that we interview, but today is a kind of a physician adjacent podcast. And I'm delighted to have Mr. Ron Richards here to talk about entrepreneurship and inventions and some of the things that he's been involved in adjacent to the medical industry. And I think it'll be a fascinating interview. So Ron, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and let them know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Crane, for inviting me to speak on your show. I appreciate that. And a little bit about myself is I've been in the healthcare industry since 1973, a respiratory therapist and a paramedic. Worked in a teaching hospital for about 8 years. And that's where I got my first try at inventing something. I invented a communication board that was used with intubated patients that were on ventilators. When you're intubated, you lose your ability to speak. And that's a big thing for us because we take that for granted that we're going to be able to talk and communicate through speech. Well, unfortunately, when you get intubated, you lose that. And there's a lot of anxiety between the patient, the caregivers, the family. And so this invention, I was lucky to have a medical director who allowed me to develop this. It went on to be sold by a manufacturer of over 100,000 units in 10 years. And it was a global success. But that was my first try at inventing something. And it was just based on a need that I saw in the hospital with my daily routines of working with patients that were on ventilators. I then went on to open up a series of sleep centers that were located in about 10 different states. So I owned and operated a chain of sleep labs essentially back in the 1990s and in 2005. But in between there, I also worked for a number of major medical manufacturers, particularly with my background, it'd be in ventilators, pulmonary function devices, anesthesia machines, and went on to work with product management, product development, and ended up with 17 patents over a period of about 25 years. Most recently, I've started getting involved with AI, and I'm managing a software platform that does remote telehealth monitoring using a wide range of peripherals to look at blood pressure, diabetes, sleep apnea, pulse rate, saturation, heart rate variability, and a number of other things. So it's a SaaS-based kind of a platform model, and it seems like it's the way of the future with integrating that along with artificial intelligence.
Fantastic. So I think it's, I think we all start off just doing kind of our normal job, like all of us. And it's interesting when somebody has a new idea and says, hey, I bet I could make this a little bit better. And I think for me, and probably for most people, it starts off and then you take it to the idea stage and you say, okay, I see something that could be better about this. I wish we had something that made this better, but I'm so busy I don't have time to think about the next step. And I think it's interesting that you saw a need and you actually did something, and then it launched this whole career path that allowed you to understand that process of creation and sharing, and then you've been able to take it across multiple patents, and even now, this many years later, you're still working in that space. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's been have had a wonderful life and got to meet a lot of different people through medicine, and also on the side, I've been lucky to tour and play music in a number of different venues, which has led me to have lifelong relationships with physicians who are also musicians. So it's been kind of a crossover blend of things. But yeah, it's one of those things, you and I talked a little bit about my book, Someday is Today. And the background behind that is an interesting story. I got invited to speak at Stanford to a group of physicians that were associated with the business part of Stanford. And these doctors had a desire to have a side gig or have a way to make additional income outside of their medical practices. But one of the theme or the thread throughout the group that I found interesting is it was their curiosity in creating, inventing something, getting a concept and taking it to commercialization or licensing it. They had a lot of different questions. So that was the background behind the book that I just wrote. And it just gives that general framework to help guide people who don't have experiences in business school or being an entrepreneur, how to take the first steps. You know, it's like eating an elephant one bite at a time.
Well, so back. Let's come back to that. I want to backtrack a little bit. So go back to the genesis of Ron Richards. You know, you started. You must have been interested in healthcare, and you became a respiratory therapist. Did you say you spent some time as a paramedic as well? Is that what I understood?
Yeah, I started working in the emergency room as a respiratory therapist, and I got interested in the role that a paramedic played in transporting patients from home or a car accident or whatever that they were involved with into the emergency room. And so oftentimes I would start talking with paramedics involved with a patient that they'd brought in and got really interested in, this is the tip of the spear. This is where a lot of action happens and you can make, great decisions or, you do a lot of things on the fly, but these people are somewhat entrepreneurial in the way they approach medicine and they've got to think outside the box a lot of times because you're confronted with thousands of different scenarios when you go out in the field and start working with different accidents.
Oh yeah, you're not in a controlled environment when you show up.
Not
You
at
try to
all.
control it, but it's chaos. I've been the director of our local EMT agency for the last 12 years or so here, and I'm often just amazed by the situations people find themselves in these crazy, uncontrolled environments, and yet you're trying to provide just exactly what the person needs in that chaotic environment so that we can bring them into a place where they are in a controlled environment so they can begin to heal. And yeah, and you're right, it requires a lot of innovation and thinking on your feet. So you were naturally attracted to that, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I'd have to say I have a great deal of curiosity, just like the doctors I talk to, about learning and discovering things and evolving products. In respiratory care, when I was a therapist, for instance, we implemented and started using high flow therapy back in the 1970s. And it was all put together with just pieces and parts from different manufacturers to accomplish that. And then we made a diagram of it. And I was lucky to work at a teaching hospital where, we could think outside the box and do things. And then we shared that with a number of other teaching institutions. And that became kind of a standard of care for high flow therapy. Well, fast forward, now you've got boxes that do everything that we did with all these pieces and parts that look like Frankenstein. And it's all in a nice little neat package to do high flow therapy. And it's now become kind of the mainstay to treat COVID and COPD in the hospital setting.
Oh yeah, we use high flow oxygen all the time for patients
Mhm.
that come in. And you're right. Yeah, I've thought about that on a number of inventions. Who was the first one to ever think about using this? And on many different fronts, but especially at a teaching institution, you're surrounded by a lot of people who have a little bit of space and freedom to think outside the box and be creative, and that's interesting. Did you start out at a teaching institution when you first got your first job was EMT and respiratory?
Yes, yeah, I did. It was in Wichita, Kansas at Wesley Medical Center. And at that time, it was around a 500 bed hospital.
So it
My,
was a
my
big
medical
institution.
director was an anesthesiologist, which was also a little bit odd. But back then, respiratory care and anesthesia kind of overlapped. And I was oftentimes brought into the OR to help with a patient that was needing ventilation in addition to while they were under anesthesia and having surgery.
Yeah, well, I work in a rural environment, and we use our EMTs and our respiratory therapists to the full extent of their licensing. For sure, we put them to work when they show up. Usually, we're needing help with a whole bunch of stuff, and anybody with the skill set gets to use that skill set, and it makes a big difference for the patients who are being served by that, for sure.
Absolutely.
So when you're going along How did you, I want to get into the book and some of the specific things that you teach in that, but on that very first one, when you decided, hey, we need to have a way for people to communicate who are intubated but conscious, how did you decide take that from this idea to actually doing it? Because that's like I say, most people those ideas stop there because you say I don't have time or I don't have the resources to put this together. I was curious how you went through that first one.
Yeah, well, I was pretty fortunate because at the time I was developing that project or that product, I was involved with the first entrepreneurship program at Wichita State University, and it was being taught by one of the people that were implementing that and actually funding it was the guy that started Pizza Hut.
Hmm.
And he brought in a lot of people that were very smart and entrepreneurs and had developed products and companies and businesses. So it kind of inspired me. Excuse me. I'm just getting over COVID
I'm sorry.
for about the third time. But yeah, it inspired me to take on this challenge of trying to figure out a simple, effective way or means to help patients communicate with staff and family members. So the first part of the project was just to realize what resources I could apply to that. And again, I was really fortunate. My medical director supported me in every way to enable me to do the project. So after patients came off of ventilators, I was allowed to interview them, and I came up with a list of the most common things that they would want or need and want to get from an outside, person because you're pretty much trapped in the bed. You can't go up, get out of bed and go to the refrigerator and help yourself. So I compiled that list and then made a prototype, really on just a cardboard sheet, and then tried it out with a few patients that were intubated. Just let them point at it with their hands. And some people that were quads or unable to use their hands, I actually developed a mouthpiece with a little plastic stick, and they could point at something just using their head. And so from there, we made a laminated copy of it that on the back put Spanish and English on the front, and then an alphabet down at the bottom so they could actually spell out some things. And it kind of just went from there. And then we published a paper through the hospital that was the American Academy of Respiratory Care. And then it got picked up by some manufacturer, and they contacted the hospital. The hospital said, "Well, Ron Richard invented this. That was really his idea." And they were kind enough to allow me to commercialize that. And they didn't ask for any money or any royalties or anything. So that was again my first experience working with a manufacturer to get to market. So a lot of this stuff, and in my book I talk about this. It's just being courageous to raise your hand, even though you may not know what the next steps are, but you got to at least take the first step in order to get going with the journey.
Oh yeah. Well, and so if you look on it from a hindsight perspective, you say that was just kind of a simple thing, and it almost, you kind of say, well, how come this hasn't been in place before? It seems so obvious that that would need to be there, but it wasn't. And you saw an unmet need, and then you talked to patients about what would have meant to the most to them and how they could have done it, and you solved it. And in some ways, a laminated piece of paper and a pointer seems simple, and yet that's where it started.
Yeah, and I talk to a lot of people that they say the same thing. It's almost like verbatim. I saw this thing that I had that idea a long time ago, 4 or 5 years ago. I had that same idea, and if I would have only taken action, I could have had my invention on the market, but I didn't take the first step.
Yeah, I've had that same idea. I think we all have. We're like, oh, I thought of that a while ago. Good thing somebody else
Yeah,
finally
well,
did what I had thought of.
that's why I use the subtitle on the book. Get your ideas out of your coffee cup and get them on the market. Because one of the doctors I talked to after my lecture at Stanford came up to me and he said, I have all these ideas about new things I could do with respiratory products to improve them, but they just sit in my coffee cup on my desk. And I just laughed and I said, I'm going to use that maybe down the road. And sure enough, it became the subtitle for the book because a lot of people, they just stare at their coffee cup and they just look at it and go, oh, and then they just put it back and they don't do anything about
That's a good point.
it.
So I know you talk about this in the book, but how would you suggest for a busy physician has lots and lots going on to actually take that next step to try to make it a reality?
Yeah, I just recently finished a project with an anesthesiologist that he was developing a new operator, a mask with a tube, and he had a full-time practice. Uh, he was self-funded. He didn't go out to anybody to ask for funding. He did his own research for patents and saved a lot of money that way. But I could tell he was very stressed out because time is something that we can't replace. I mean, we can make more money, work harder, but replacing time, and it took time away from his family. He was working weekends on this idea. So that's a big challenge for people. And if you're going to try something, in terms of starting an idea and get it from concept to I say commercialization, uh, I use a crawl, walk, run approach. Be patient, be thoughtful, and really consider the time that it's going to take and the effort it's going to take because it's time, money, resources, commitment. Be courageous, be patient. All those elements kind of build to a company or a product. And I tell a lot of people, don't think you have to start a company just to get an invention on the market. You can license things. There's a lot of different avenues you can explore to get things onto the market without you having to go full blown into a building and hiring a big staff and having a big company with all that burden to you. But you can if you want to. A lot of people I've worked with, the beauty of it is job creation. They've started companies off of an idea, then come up with a pipeline of products off the one idea, and then they go from 4 or 5 employees up to 100, within a few years. And that's a really beautiful thing when that happens.
Oh yeah. Well, and then I think every business that starts, I mean, I don't know what the rate is, however many good ideas come through. And of course, they're not all going to be winners. People have an idea and they try it and you might fail on your first couple of times. What do you think about that? Like, would you say that most of the ideas that you brought to market were winners at the beginning, or what's the failure rate? I suppose is one way to ask that.
Yeah, it's fairly high initially, I think, with inventors, and it was with myself. I probably would say at least 50% of the products that I initially tried never got to market. They either didn't satisfy the needs of the patient or the clinical community, or one of the chapters in my book, it talks in depth about this because you can spend a lot of time and money working on something that you love. It's your baby. It's like I think this is the best thing. I've never seen it before, but I do this. And then lo and behold, if you go, the internet's a great thing now to go out and just look and search and see and type in search words similar to what you're working on. That's what I encourage people to do is do a lot of in-depth research before you take the step of building prototypes, putting money into it. Filing for a patent now today can cost you $5,000 or more just to do that. And a lot of times you get a patent and it's really kind of worthless. You'll see people copy stuff and knock it off. But if you find something on the market that's similar, then the next step is, I say, hire a patent attorney and do a thorough USPTO search and make sure you're not infringing on some art, prior art. And there's not something out there like it. Because we can get kind of myopic and, like I say, you really get endeared to some idea and you build a little prototype and people go, wow, that's really great, Dr. Crane. I wished I'd have thought of that. And then you get carried away and swept away with all this. Before you know it, you've sunk a lot of time and money into something that's already on the market.
I see. So you're saying if you had the idea, you want to make sure that you're not just copying somebody else's idea, or somebody else had the idea first and already has basically built 90% of what you had in mind. So it needs
Right.
to be a little bit unique, or fill a specific vacuum or specific space that hasn't been filled. And then, like you said, it would require some money at that point to have patent lawyer or somebody look into the specifics of getting it patented in your name if it's reasonable. But would you say that's the first step? I mean, or internet research and that kind of thing, or what would you say is your first step for a person?
Yeah, I would just go on the internet. The USPTO site used to be really easy for novices to get in and use. About 2 years ago, they changed the software coding in the program. Now is incredibly complicated to do searches. So I just suggest people go on the internet and type in, search words that are associated with your product. So, like this doctor I told you I worked with, an operator, and what's different about it, what's better, and he did get a patent on it. And then finally got some additional outside funding, and then is working with a manufacturer to make it and start commercializing it. And that's the other part of it too, Dr. Crane, is once you get a prototype, you've got the functionality down, you maybe done a little bit of testing on some models or animal models or simulators or whatever, because you really can't test it on patients until you get, your FDA approval. And that's another whole chapter in my book. But the part about it then is, once you get that functional prototype, you may want to just contact some manufacturers that are in that space. And you can easily find that out find out who's a sales rep that's calling on your hospital, that's working with a company that you respect, you think they're ethical, moral company, they make good products, and get a name on the inside that works in marketing or product management, and see if you can talk to somebody under a non-disclosure and see if they're interested in licensing or buying your product.
Oh, that is a good idea because I think all of us, I mean, we're not in silos per se, but you work in your clinic or your specialty or your hospital and you kind of just do one thing. And it does seem like kind of branching out quite a bit to reach out to an industry specialist or someone that works a lot in that. And you're right. You don't want to share your idea so broadly that somebody else copies it. But you're right. If you can get a non-disclosure agreement, talk to somebody about it in specifics and kind of float the idea with someone that actually understands it, it can be a really positive thing for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And like you said earlier, after you get some experience in developing and prototyping and basic engineering and things like that, you'll find that people make less mistakes and they get mature, and that experience leads to a higher success rate.
Did you find, you've done this a bunch of times now, as you got better at it and more experience, did you typically go, were you working with physicians or were you working primarily with industry developers, or how did you usually, as you got better at it, what would you say your kind of typical way of managing it was?
Yeah, and again, I'll go back to my experience initially working in the hospital as a therapist and meeting sales reps and talking to them about their products and whatnot. So when I got involved with big companies, corporations that had, multiple disciplinary departments like engineering, regulatory, and all this type of stuff, I brought my concept for developing products was from the eyes of the clinician and the patient. And oftentimes I found a lot of resistance in some companies and in some departments, particularly engineering, who thought, there's nobody smarter than me. I know how to develop, and I'm a mechanical engineer. I went to MIT, and I know how to do this. And I would always say, well, that's great, but you know what? If you want to hit a home run, let's build a product from the eyes and the ears and the touch and the feel of the clinician or patient. So oftentimes we would engage with under consulting agreements, usually bring in who we thought were key opinion leaders to look at a product in different phases. So it would be, here's the initial concept. Okay, we'll talk through it. Then we'll build a little prototype. We would let them use it in a lab setting, get some more feedback, maybe do some focus groups with respiratory therapists or doctors, and then from there evolve the project to where we're checking off the boxes. And that type of phase gate step process, it ensures a higher degree of success when you go to market, If you don't do those things, what I've learned is just the opposite. You end up launching a product and then having version one, version two, version three within the first year, because now all of a sudden you've got the whole population of therapists and clinicians using something, calling up your customer service, telling them, how did you ever design this? This thing is completely backwards. And so you don't want that. You want to go to market with what you feel like is a 10, uh, is a home run, not something that's just mediocre.
Yeah. Well, and that's a little bit tricky because, like you said, you can't really test things on patients unless you go through an IRB process or an FDA approval process initially. So it is a little bit tricky to test some of those. I've seen, like for example, on a colonoscopy patients recently, somebody came out with a strap that goes around the abdomen just to make it so that the colonoscope is less likely to loop, rather than having an assistant put pressure on the abdomen so much. They use this strap that goes around the abdomen, and it's been a wonderful invention. But I think it's interesting. It really is just a Velcro strap that goes around a person's body, and
Simple.
it's simple, it's very effective, and it's interesting. You wouldn't really be able to test it on animals so much. You had to kind of get concept, proof of concept, and bring it to market. And it's an idea that I think everybody's like, oh, I should have thought of that. And probably people did use it informally, but now they've got a name brand product that you can order, and it works so well for patients, and it seems to be covered well enough by the hospitals that it doesn't seem to add much to the cost and increases efficiency. But things like that, I think are interesting. How you would actually bring that to market. I'm assuming they had to do work with some industry leaders and have it tested out, or get an IRB approval to test it in a patient setting. Maybe in a university. But it is interesting to see how you would actually bring something like that to light.
Yeah. I oftentimes, if I had questions about specific things related to how a patient was going to interact with the device that we were working on, would not hesitate to get an IRB put together and work with usually at least two to three centers that would cooperate, use the same protocol, use the same prototypes, and then gather information that we wanted to learn about what we could learn under an IRB setting. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a good way to legally go forward and test something prior to getting your 510K.
Yeah. Well, and another direction I wanted to ask you a little bit is, as people have done this, you have to be careful not to take so much risk that you put your finances in risk, because you don't want it may or may not work, but it also has the potential to be its own revenue generator and contribute to financial independence and the ability for a physician or any other health professional to have a different revenue stream, so that you can continue to create. And I think that's basically what you discovered. You had some success, and then you were able to learn how to do it more and more. Curious about any comments you have regarding the finances of this, because that becomes one of the challenges to do something like this.
Mhm. Yeah, like I mentioned, that one doctor, he self-funded for a while, and then ended up raising money through a venture capital. And in my book, I talk about there's really four methods or four means by which you can raise money. And there's a fifth, and I'll talk a little bit about how it's becoming more popular. But the first is self-funding. Second, family and friends. Third would be venture capital. Venture capitalists typically fund things that are pioneering, innovative, low risk, and have a good ROI, return on their investment, and kind of become the springboard for an entrepreneur or an inventor. And they'll usually, their appetite for investment is between $1 and $3 million. Once you start commercializing a product and you start seeing sales ramp up beyond 10 million, that's kind of the threshold. You'll be then in you'll kind of transition away from VC partnerships and money, and probably get more involved with private equity, because they're going to want to fund things that are between 10 and 50 to 100 million.
Hmm.
And they'll take a semi-mature company, and they'll become an accelerator for it. They'll put in funding. They'll also have strategic relationships with companies or hospitals that you can get your products into, or the VA, or government contracts and so on. So those are the kind of the four ways. The fifth one that's emerging is, and I'm kind of surprised, but there's a lot of GoFundMe opportunities that have popped up on the market, and there's other options besides GoFundMe. But I've seen some doctors and medical entrepreneurs raise quite a bit of money through GoFundMe.
And the person
Like,
who's contributing on GoFundMe they don't get a piece of it if they are successful. It really is just somebody who says, I want to see this idea come to light, so
yeah,
much so that I'll contribute a small amount to that effort.
yeah, usually it's around $100 or something like that. But yeah, they don't get a device to use, obviously, because it's under 510(k) unless they have a doctor that'll prescribe it for them once it gets on the market.
Hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. And on the backside of it, if somebody is successful with it, once if somebody says, "Look, I'm the inventor of it, but I worked with private equity, or I worked with um, I worked with all these funding mechanisms," does the person who is the owner of it still? How much of the royalties do they maintain? Are they able to derive an income from it at that point when you have all these other investors involved?
Yeah, that's the trick, is to maintain controlling interest and ownership, and don't lose that, because that's very valuable down the road. Uh, and the percentage that a private equity or VC is going to take, it's going to vary. And it's just all negotiations. But you don't want to give up 51%. You want to maintain control for a number of different reasons. And I didn't answer your earlier question about um, it. You asked about how much money would you invest. It's kind of like going to Vegas and putting a cap on how much am I willing to lose or gamble. And that's kind of the way I look at this too. I've self-funded. I've worked with VCs. I've worked with private equity, um, friends and family. Pretty much all of it. But you have to decide, uh, just like you do with other investments, like how much stock am I going to buy? How much Costco am I willing to risk? Is the stock going to go up or going to go down? You have to do that with your inventions, and kind of work with your financial planner or your family, your wife, or whoever, and just say, I'm thinking about putting $100,000 into this invention or idea. Does this sound reasonable? And bounce things off of people. You could have good friends, you could have your family, you could have your financial planner. If you have a friend that's an attorney, run it by them. But it's always good to get second and third opinions about if you're going to be spending a lot of time and money on a project.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things we talk about on this podcast is just having a financial plan, and as you know, physicians are about 10 years behind most other professionals on wealth building, because you don't finish medical training until you're in your 30s sometime, and a lot of other folks have been in a wealth gathering stage, since their early 20s when they finished a bachelor's or master's degree, and it's just such a prolonged process. And so I just kind of listening to you, I've in those first 5 to 10 years after residency, most people are just kind of getting back to broke. They're paying off their debts and they're trying to get a home and build just a little bit of a nest egg so that it can grow and develop into something that they will need when they are in their older years, ready to retire, or want to use it for different investments. And so basically what you're saying is, if it costs a bunch of money, you wouldn't want to put your whole financial house at risk for something like this. Like you pointed out, if you were going to Las Vegas, you wouldn't put 90% of your wealth on a risk, on a gamble. But if you got to the place where you said, okay, I'm financially secure and I've got enough in my nest egg that it will continue to grow, and if I lost this amount of money, I'm not really out too much. My financial goals will still be met on kind of on the same time frame. Then you can do it. But you're right; it's high risk, high reward, like so many things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll reiterate that probably 8 out of 10 uh, either fail, or they're just kind of, you're not going to make a lot of money out of it. My wife's a doctor, and she keeps talking about retiring. And I have a lot of friends that are doctors, and they're in their 70s now, and they're still either part-time or full-time practices. And, we kid and joke about it, but the fact of the matter is things are getting a lot more expensive and people are working uh, until they're, a little bit older than maybe we did a few generations ago. So it affects doctors, it affects everybody that we're having to work. I'm going to be 72 and I'm still working full time. My wife's 67 and she's working full time. So, and part of that is we don't want to retire, but we still feel like we can contribute and we're active and we want to stay active doing that. But the other part of it is too, we like to go on vacations and have nice things. So
No, it's a balancing act for sure. And like you said earlier, time is the one thing you can't get more of. And so you just have to play your financial cards right. But if you have a winner of an idea, I think basically talking to you, I think that's what you would say is look into it, try it out, because eventually somebody else is going to probably come up with something pretty similar, and you'll come back and say, "Oh, I wish I had taken that to market myself, if I had just taken a little bit of time." But I would be nervous if somebody came to me in their first 5 to 10 years after residency and said, "I'm going to put $100,000 on this investment all at once," unless you had really saved carefully, or had no debt or something like that, because it is a little bit tricky in those early years. After people have kind of paid off their debts and are a little bit more financially secure, it seems like it would be an easier time to take some of those risks.
mhm. Oh,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
So I want to hear a little bit about your musical career. That's been threaded through. When I read your profile, I thought, well, this is interesting. He's had this career that does all sorts of healthcare things and has worked with patents. But you've also been able to perform at hundreds of shows. I'm just curious, how did that interface with this? How did you get into music? I know that's not necessarily the topic of this podcast, but I think it's really interesting from a human interest standpoint.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I've been interested in music since I was probably 8 or 9 years old. I started in the Texas Boys Choir doing Broadway musicals when I was 8 or 9 years old, and then from there I learned how to play saxophone, flute, harmonica, percussion, and that afforded me to get involved with a lot of different styles of music and different bands and tour up and down the West Coast with a lot of rock bands and blues bands. But I guess one of the things that came upon when I was working with people at Stanford, I met a lot of doctors there that were musicians, and the musical community, it's a universal language when you start talking about music. It's like, hey, we're going to have a jam session over here at this bar. Why don't you come over tonight and set in? So I developed a lot of friendships and was able to play shows at venues all over the world. And a lot of times it was associated with medical events, like conferences and things like that. So in fact, I'm going to do a show in Seattle in June with an all-star blues band, and I'm the only non-physician in the band.
How interesting. Yeah. I was curious. I was going to ask if you were still doing it. It sounds like you are, and you found a bunch of doctors who are interested in music and finding, filling that part of their lives. And that's cool. You're right. Music is kind of a universal language for all of us. Everybody can enjoy a good concert, good show, a good recording. Well, I think, like I say, with this, it's good to kind of go back with this, Ron, because people will look at something like this and say, "Oh, I could never do that. I could never be like Ron Richards, or I could never be like someone that's playing in the band." Or I mean, there's a lot of different things, but I think it's good best to just find what you're good at and try to be the best version of what you can be, and take the opportunities that come. And I think that's essentially what you did. You had an opportunity that came, and you tried it with something fairly simple, and then you found a way forward to keep after it. And not only that, now you've been able to kind of coach other people into that. And this book sounds like it would be a good resource, a good place to start if someone wants to get an idea. Someday is today. I like that idea too, that you don't have to wait till you're 90 years old to do it. You can start now if you put put your resources and your thoughts together. You can make it happen.
Hmm. Yeah, it's available on Amazon under Someday is Today. Get your ideas out of your coffee cup and on the market. And I just wanted to mention, I just published a new book that came on Amazon last week. that I worked on for about 3 years, and it's a sci-fi murder mystery in a medical setting, and it's tied kind of to my background in sleep medicine, but it's about sleep and dreaming and how powerful our dreams are and what they can reveal. So if you want to check that book out, it's called The Zenith Project.
The Zenith Project. Well, that sounds interesting. Ron, I think this has been fascinating to listen to. It's really interesting to hear all the different ideas and how to bring those to market, and also your medical career and also your authorship. You've been able to take all these things, you just need like 4 or 5 more decades. You could just keep creating and doing more and more and more. Pretty
Yeah,
neat.
that would be great, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, we are all limited to a few decades, no matter what.
Yes. Yeah. But
Well,
yeah, it was
Ron,
nice meeting you. And thank you so much again for the invite to your
of course,
program.
yeah. Any other thoughts to share with our audience today?
No, just be courageous and take the first step. If you've got a good idea, do the research on it and get comfortable with if I put time and money into this, it may be successful and may make you some additional side money, but also create jobs and give you the satisfaction of seeing something that you developed, get on the market, and actually used on patients.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, Ron, and I hope to catch up with you later. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for tuning into the Doctors Making a Difference podcast. And thank you for what you do to help your patients and your community. Your work truly helps so many people. We produce this content to help you have the tools you need to stay in medicine and to highlight the amazing work being done by physicians around the world. Please note that while I am a physician, and many of the guests on this program are also physicians or other professionals, the discussions on this podcast do not represent my employer or any professional organizations to which I belong. This podcast is for your information and entertainment only, and should not be taken as professional advice. You should seek appropriate professional advice pertaining to your own situation. Please check out more of our content on our website, doctorsmakingadifference.com. Also, please follow, like, or subscribe on your podcast player or YouTube channel and give us a 5-star rating. It really helps to spread the message. Finally, if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, or if you'd like to nominate someone else to be a guest, please visit the website or email admin@doctorsmakingadifference.com. See you next time.